Hello, and welcome to Poetry at the Dalí. I'm Hank Hine, the museum director, and it's my honor to welcome more poets to our program. This program is sponsored by the city of St. Petersburg, and we're very fortunate to have as its curator, the Poet Laureate of St. Petersburg, Helen Pruitt Wallace. And it is our tradition to ask Helen first to read a poem of her own before introducing the poets today. Welcome, Helen Pruitt Wallace.
Thank you so much, Hank. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the viewers for tuning in. Thanks for being with us, and I'm especially excited to have three terrific poets with us this evening. We have Linda Pastan, Jean Nordhaus, and Danny Lawless. Actually four, because of course, those of you who watch our program regularly know that Hank Hine is also a wonderful poet, and we're lucky to have him at the helm of this museum and have his support for the Dalí Poetry Series, which is now going on its 6th year. Hard to imagine.
Bravo.
Yeah. So I will read one poem. Thank you, Hank. And I was originally going to read a poem that Danny kindly accepted for Plume, that will be in one of his forthcoming issues. And but I've changed my mind, Danny. Sorry to switch it up on you, but we've just had an anniversary of the death of my brother, a younger brother, who died several years ago at age 25. And I decided to read a poem that I wrote for him a while back. And I think the only thing you need to know about this poem, he was passionate about skydiving, and he died in an airplane accident. So the poem is written in 2 parts. The second part refers to a Mingan bride, which is it refers to a Chinese ghost marriage, because in certain parts of China, if a family lost a son, the parents often tried to find a bride who had also died to bury nearby. And so there's a reference to that in this poem. So this is for my brother Mark. It's called Epilogues for a Brother. You do it like the hero in the movie, eject just before the plumed crash. Your white chute floating like milkweed toward some grassy field. And there, a girl, her black dog, maybe tossing pebbles in a stream or gathering fistfuls of daisies, drops her wicker basket on the ground and races for the sun's pearled glare. She finds you in a puddle of silk, dazed, bruised barely, but enough to need her soft shoulder as you hobble to her house for soup and the buoyant rest of your life. 2, Mingan bride, afterlife marriage. Assume the rest of your life doesn't happen. Take this burnt offering of cash and to cruise the netherworld, a paper model of a Cessna SE. Like those along the Yellow River Canyon, seeking dead wives for dead sons to bury them side by side. I too would offer gold, 10,000 yuan, a dowry for the dead, if you, brother, wanted a bride. Who's to say desire won't outlive us? In the Lowe's Plateau, the poorest parents weave the wives from straw, trusting the chemistry of dirt. There's wisdom in a match like that. Okay, so we have a real treat ahead of us this evening. I want to first introduce Danny Lawless. Danny is here this evening in his role as editor of the fabulous journal Plume. And he's going to speak to us a little bit about that. We have had Danny as a reader before with Jay Hopler. He is a terrific poet, and he's going to be reading for us again soon. Hopefully some poems in a manuscript he has in progress. I think a book he's about to wrap up. So Danny's book, The Gun My Sister Killed Herself With, was published in 2018. Recent and forthcoming poems have been in Field, Barrow Street, Prairie Schooner, Ploughshares, Poetry International, Los Angeles Review, Upstreet, and Massachusetts Review, among other journals and reviews. You've been busy, Danny. That's terrific. A recipient of a continuing Shifting Foundation grant. He's the founder and editor of Plume, a journal of contemporary poetry. And also the anthology of Plume Poetry. Welcome, Danny. So happy that you could be with us this evening.
Thank you, Helen. What a marvelous, sometimes hopeful but wrenching poem. It's a really beautiful thing. Thank you. I'm just going to speak briefly about the way in which these two poets, great poets, Linda Pastan and Jean Nordhaus, came together. They are part of a series of pairings that comprise the new Plume Poetry 9, an anthology. And here's a look at it. I happen to have a copy here that looks like that. And I can look at some of the names. We begin with Alberto Rios, and we have Dennis Nurks, and Linda, of course, and Molly Peacock, and Ross Gay, and Timothy Liu, and Victoria Chang. Lots of people that you probably know in the poetry world, which to some extent follows the pattern of previous Plume anthologies. We're about, obviously, to mark our 10th year as an entity with next year's anthology. Oh, I should say, one of my favorite poets is the feature poet in Plume Poetry 9, and that's Diane Seuss, and she's really remarkable. And so usually we have about 90 poets that I solicit and correspond with, and their poems end up in the print anthology. But this year we did something different, and I tell you, I haven't been as excited about an anthology as I have been about this one in quite a while, because the approach is different this time. In the past, it's been I who has been the gatekeeper, in a way, I suppose, selecting the poets who would appear in the anthology. But this year, I think the reason we did this, poetry has gotten so large and diverse, even in the last 10 years, in its little renaissance that is undergoing, that any one poetical approach or perspective or experience is individual. It cannot be consolidated in the hands of a single person, and certainly not in my own hands. So I turned my editorship over, in effect, to 45 guest editors, of which Linda is one. And the format is each of the 45 fairly well-known poets or established poets, I suppose you might want to call them, or fortunate poets, have offered us a poem. And then each of those 45 poets or guest editors has chosen a poet whom they believe, for one reason or another, it could be many reasons, has not received the attention or spotlight that he, she, or they deserves. And I have to tell you, as with today's pairing, the selections of our guest editor / poets have been remarkable. It's been invigorating for the anthologies, and it's a chance to meet poets that perhaps I might not have otherwise. And an odd sort of pairing goes, an odd sort of vibration I found manifests itself between one poet and the next. Breton, speaking of Breton, I'm thinking of the communicating vessels, where those two entities play off one another, dialogue with one another in some odd way that is amplifying of both works. So again, the anthology is here. I'm so pleased that Linda and Jean have chosen or were able to come and read for us. We have a series of other readings called Station to Station. I think we're in our 6th one there out of the Writer Center in Washington, D.C., and we're reading with some other pairings from the anthology. But today is really special. Linda and I have been corresponding, it seems like for 5 or 6 years now. And I think she mentioned just before we came on that we had met briefly, probably in some reading or AWP, but it's so wonderful to see her and now to be able to hear her read and to see what she has to say about Jean and Jean Nordhaus. I'm so looking forward to listening to you read your work as well. I loved both Linda's and Jean's work in the anthology, and I'm very grateful, as I am grateful also to Hank and to Helen for bringing these things together for the Dalí. Thank you so much.
And I'd like to add, if I may, that if you haven't yet read Danny's introductions and his newsletters that preface these wonderful journals, you need to do it, because really, Danny, it's an art form in and of itself. The way that you introduce the journals is terrific. So thank you, Danny. I'd like to introduce now Linda Pastan. Linda's 14th book of poems, Insomnia, was published in October of 2015 and won the Towson University Prize for Literature. She has twice been a finalist for the National Book Award, and in 2003, she won the Ruth Lilly Prize for Lifetime Achievement. A Dog Runs Through It was published in May of 2018, and Almost an Elegy is due in 2022. We are so very happy to have Linda. Before she begins her reading, though, I'd like to also introduce Jean Nordhaus. Jean's 6 volumes of poetry include Memos from the Broken World, The Porcelain Apes of Moses Mendelssohn, and Innocence, winner of the Charles B. Wheeler Award from Ohio State University Press. She's published work in American Poetry Review, The New Republic, and Poetry, among other journals, and served for 8 years as the review editor of Poet Lore. So welcome to you also, Jean. And Linda, we look forward to hearing you first, and then you'll say a few words about Jean. Thank you.
Thank you. There. I thought that I would start by reading a group of poems that first appeared in Plume. They're quite different from each other because Plume really does a remarkable job of being inclusive in the kinds of poems that they publish. This one is the title poem for my book that will be coming out next year, Almost an Elegy, and in this case, it's for Tony Hoagland. Almost an Elegy. Your poems make me want to write my poems, which is a kind of plagiarism of the spirit. But when your death reminds me that mine is on its way, I close the book, clinging to this tenuous world the way the leaves outside cling to their tree just before they turn color and fall. I need time to read all the poems you left behind, which pierced the darkness here at my window, but did nothing to save you. This from class notes. I went to a high school, a college, 2 graduate schools, and my children went to various schools, and they all send me class notes. So here it is. My high school class of 1950 is disappearing over the edge of the world, a snowless avalanche. Rosalie of the pancake makeup, Alex, who outran us even towards death, 3 Susans, 2 Davids, and a Roger. When I see our class representative's name on an incoming email, I think of how families must have felt during World War II when they saw the Western Union bicycle approaching. And I remember all of us lining up in gym class as captains chose their teams. The line would dwindle until, on one leg then the other, I was standing almost alone. Maybe whoever is doing the choosing now thinks I would be no good at dying. This next one was called Imaginary Conversation. Actually, I think all poems are imaginary conversations with our readers, but this is a specific imaginary conversation. You tell me to live each day as if it were my last. This is in the kitchen where before coffee I complain of the day ahead, that obstacle race of minutes and hours, grocery stores and doctors. But why the last, I ask? Why not live each day as if it were the first, all raw astonishment, Eve rubbing her eyes awake that first morning, the sun coming up like an ingenue in the east. You grind the coffee with the small roar of a mind trying to clear itself. I set the table, glance out the window where dew has baptized every living surface. Eve made her way into that poem as she manages to do in an enormous number of my poems. I once actually wrote a poem called Eve on her deathbed, thinking I could stop writing about her, but I haven't been able to. Anyway, this one is called Silent Treatment. This is for my mother at 20, more beautiful than she knew, choosing my father, more volatile than she could have guessed. And this is for me at 10, punished again with silence for imaginary crimes, learning to apologize for the sake of peace between them. Why is the garden blooming outside this window and lush with color less real to me than the gardens of childhood, scentless and silent and bristling with thorns? And this is the poem that's in the anthology, Anonymous. On the page, all the lines that I quote from anonymous poems are in quotation marks, so the reader can tell which they are, but you'll just have to imagine which lines are mine and which lines are from anonymous. And the poem is really written to anonymous. Summer is coming in, you wrote, and Lady, Queen of Paradise. And from a phone booth, you called police to tell them what you saw. Man or woman hiding in plain sight, that shadow behind us in the mirror. You pledged your dollars on the radio, mail grueling information in an unmarked envelope. You aren't modest. Being invisible is your power, and it survives the ages. Nameless, incognito, lost in a crowd. Under the neutral sky, we all die anonymous, loud, sing, cuckoo. I really prefer reading in person rather than on Zoom, but particularly in this case, I would have loved a chance to visit the Dalí Museum in Florida and hope maybe someday I'll be able to. Meanwhile, what I thought I'd do was the rest of the poems that I'm going to read all either take place in a museum or were inspired by a painting in a museum that I visited. I'll go into a museum and actually sit on the floor with my notebook and start scribbling about some picture or other that I'm looking at. And this is a collection of some of those. This one is about an Edvard Munch woodcut The title of the poem is the title of the painting, The Woodcut, Women on the Shore. The pills I take to postpone death are killing me, and the healing journey we packed for waits with its broken airplane, the malarial hum of mosquitoes. Even the newly mowed domestic grass hides fault lines in the earth, which could open at any time and swallow us. In Edvard Munch's Woodcut, the pure geometry of color, an Arctic sky, the luminescent blues and greens of water, surrounds the woman in black whose head is turning to a skull. If death is everywhere we look, at least let's marry it to beauty. And I guess that's what all artists and poets are ultimately trying to do. This is an older poem that is about museums, ethics. In ethics class so many years ago, our teacher asked this question every fall. If there were a fire in a museum, which would you save? A Rembrandt painting or an old woman who hadn't many years left anyhow? Restless on hard chairs, caring little for pictures or old age, we'd opt 1 year for life, the next for art, and always half-heartedly. Sometimes the woman borrowed my grandmother's face, leaving her usual kitchen to wander some drafty, half-imagined museum. 1 year, feeling clever, I replied, why not let the woman decide herself? Linda, the teacher, would report, eschews the burdens of responsibility. This fall, in a real museum, I stand before a real Rembrandt, old woman, or nearly so myself. The colors within this frame are darker than autumn, darker even than winter, the browns of earth, though earth's most radiant elements burn through the canvas. I know now that woman and painting and season are almost one and all beyond saving by children. Okay, here we go with Eve again. And this time she's an important player in this poem. I saw this painting in London. It's by Lucas Cranach the Elder. It was painted in 1526 and simply called Adam and Eve. She seems a mere girl, really, small-breasted and slim, her body luminescent next to Adam, who scratches his head in mild perplexity. So many baubles hang from the tree, it didn't hurt to pick one. The snake is a quicksilver curve on a branch she is almost young enough to swing from. The garden bores her anyway. No weedy chaos among the flowers and vegetables. The animals so tame you can hardly tell the lamb from the lion, the doe from the stag, whose antlers outline Adam's modesty. She is like that teenage girl who wandered from the mall last week, not to be seen again. The world before her, glittering and perilous. And that last line is a kind of take on Milton's last line when they leave the garden. This is about a very different kind of a museum. It's a train museum, and I visited it so long ago that I don't remember what state it was in, but I do remember the museum, at the train museum. Topeka, Junction City, Santa Fe. The places the imagination takes us are simply these. All points east, the conductor calls in that old plain chant, and a girl with a suitcase steals down the porch stairs. Rivers, bridges, cornfields with stalks as tasseled as the plaited hair of children all over Kansas, falling asleep to the loon-like call of trains. I board one more time, sensing the quicksilver tracks, how they branch towards a future where I've long since been carried, swaying and only half awake. And just two more poems. This one is also quite old. I wrote it at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, where there was a wonderful Chinese art exhibit many years ago. And the poem is called Funerary Tower, Han Dynasty. But what made me want to write this poem was that they have little explanations often under paintings. And what they had under this one was the meaning of the figures carrying babies in their arms is not clear. That somehow entertained me, an art critic saying. So, Funerary Tower, Han Dynasty. In this season of salt, leaves drop away, revealing the structure of the trees. Good bones, as my father would say, drawing the hair from my face, I pull impatiently away. Today, we visit my father's grave. My mother housekeeps with trowel among the stones, already at home here. Impatient, even at 40, I hurry her home. We carry our childhoods in our arms. And I'm going to end with a poem. It's about the Phillips Museum here in Washington, one of my very favorite museums. And they have a lot of Bonnard paintings. And the story is, and I think it's true, though I'm not positive, that when Bonnard would visit Washington, he'd go to the Phillips Gallery with his paintbrush and paints, and he would make changes on the paintings of his that were hanging on the walls. And the guards were told, if you ever see Mr. Bonnard coming down the street, hide the paintings in back. So I had to write a poem about that. It's called Vermilion. Pierre Bonnard would enter the museum with a tube of paint in his pocket and a sable brush. Then, violating the sanctity of one of his own frames, he'd add a stroke of vermilion to the skin of a flower. Just so, I stopped you at the door this morning and, licking my index finger, removed an invisible crumb from your vermilion mouth, as if at the ritual moment of departure, I had to show you still belong to me, as if revision with the purest form of love. And we poets all know that revision is the purest form of love. I'm happy now to introduce Jean Nordhaus, whose poems I've been reading for years and years. And I'm just going to quote very briefly from what I wrote about her in the anthology. Hers is the poetry of keen intelligence. In language that is both spare and resonant, she shows us the simplest things in a way that are new. And that's what I think the best poetry tries to do. So, Jean, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Linda, always for your encouragement, and to Plume for publishing me and us together, and to the museum, of course, for sponsoring this reading. I was going to end with the poem from the anthology, but since Linda did her introduction from the anthology, I think I'll start with that poem. We are so beset these days by sort of huge interconnected problems, climate change, pandemic, floods of immigrants. And so I wrote this poem not conscious of those things, but they always invade our consciousness. So this poem is In Winter, the Crickets Come. In winter, the crickets come, an army of big-eyed refugees, some large as a colonel's thumb, others tinier than a baby's toenail, even the smallest ones complete and perfect. They pour over every border, crazy to share our warmth, sip and yet their voices pulse like braille, a bodiless harmonic braille, and yet their voices pulse like light, harmonic braille, a bodiless ventriloquy of selves, their immigrant anthems rise and swell. So thinking about how to choose poems for today, I hear that the Dalí Museum is simply wonderful, and the two exhibits that Hank described sound fabulous. I wish I were in St. Petersburg now to attend them, but I thought, surrealism would be a good theme to start with. And so I thought I'd start with a few early poems that I have not read or even thought about in years. But it was a time when I was reading women poets like Linda, but also a lot of the male poet, like a young Linda at the time, and then male poets very influenced by French surrealism like Mark Strand and Merwin. So the first of these is called Pink. I started out to write a poem. I was going to write a series of poems about colors, but I never got beyond pink. And that took me places I didn't expect to go. Pink knocks me flat as I enter. I wake to examine the velvet of my swollen lids, hear murmurs. The walls press closer and hum, warming me up. At 98.6, I hear her body singing as she pumps me her digested breakfast, pushes my lungs open and closed. Somewhere behind my eyes, a fist, red as a ham, throbs, my heart learning to beat. And the second of the poem of these this was from my very earliest, my first chapbook, is another in which hands tend to have a rather surreal life of their own. Her hands. Sometimes when her mind roams, they grab for her throat, where she discovers them groping about in the knife bin, reaching blind into baskets of razors. She busies them with needlework, intricate fisherman sweaters, cabled as veins, clumsy, they jab with bone-sharp fingers. One shakes a fist behind her back, only joking it waves when she turns, or shadows the wolf sign on the wall, thumb for a pricked ear, pinky working jaw. In dreams, they rummage through medicine cabinets, seeking old poisons. The blue flame in her pulse jumps like a fish. She would set them free at the wrists, but fears the silver when they leap. Slender swimmers, such havoc, cutting arcs and circles in the blue air. And the next poem is from my most recent book, and the title is also the first line. I was always leaving. I was always leaving. I was about to get up and go. I was on my way, not sure where, somewhere else, not here. Nothing here was enough. It would be better there where I was going, not sure how or why. The dome I cowered under would be raised and I would be released into my true life. I would meet there the ones I was destined to meet. They would make an opening for me among the flutes and boulders, and I would be taken up. That this might be a form of death did not occur to me. I only know that something always held me back, a doubt, a debt, a face I could not leave behind. When the door fell open, I did not go through. The next poem was inspired by a runner passing me in a car, and I'm always impressed by the eternal hopefulness of people who run and exercise. I was trying, and the poem is written in long, narrow lines, and I was trying to imitate a little bit the rhythm of the runner himself. He is running in the rain, and the rain feels good. How good to have a body, he is thinking, though he's not exactly thinking as he runs among the raindrops, tapping out a city metric, little psalm and ditty of the body's pleasure. How precise the rigging, tight the buttock muscles locking in their grooves, the neurons setting off their chained explosions. I will never die, insists the body as it hums along inside the rain. And one of the last poems in that book is about language itself, which is the poet's brush and canvas and oil paints, and also the sculpture's materials. But language is the material in which we write, and it's very ephemeral. This is called Two Words. Two words, their shapes and sounds and syllables, their silences, the little song they make in the mouth, the way they fill with breath and sail away, or whirl like caged winds in the dark brain closet. To their swift couplings, the strict rules that keep them dancing in lines, the way they break out and return, to the ones that return and the ones unspoken, the ones released and regretted, even you, little foxes, false friends, to words that ushered us in, mama, papa, dog, whatever moves in us and moves us, monkey heritage passed down, potsherds of history I hold in my mouth when I speak. To my mother's words that will circle in me till I die, to dead words lying on their sides in airless tombs, their songs silenced, feathers furled, whole languages extinguished with their flavors and flowers and hymns and innuendos, their epics and curses, the voices they lived in. And keeping the dead languages alive, as we, so many language, when a language like an indigenous language, or as Yiddish almost did during World War II, when a language dies, what it takes with it is a whole world and culture. And this is called Yiddish. Sometimes when my mother opened her mouth to speak, a shoe tumbled out, or a featherless chicken that settled its head on my pillow, claw feet clenched in prayer. That's when I learned to fear sleep and to watch the tongue for danger, to throw scraps of paper over the rail and watch them fall, each fluttering word a white dove. Now I pluck them back and bury them until they bloom again on the tip of my tongue and rhyme. The kiss and the pillow, the tree and the plum, a house built of wood and others like stanzas, a village of stanzas, a school, a bridge, the song running under it quick as a scale, the sofa's long black coat turned inside out, patched with diminutives, basted with stitching of every color. I try it on. It fits me perfectly. The syllables fit in my mouth like smoke in the chimney, like milk in a thimble, the child in its grave. And just two more poems. And I'm going to read another poem of language having been always my fascination. This is about the physical act of speaking and how language brings us into the world. Learning to say yes. First, I stretch my lips as if to smile. With my tongue, I spade my teeth apart, lifting the palate. This makes an opening the size of a spoon. Am I a wren waiting to sip water from the morsels mother brings? No, it's for singing. Strumming the air across my throat, I make a sound like winter stirring in grass. Now the leaves, worn from waiting my consent, let go. Stars lurch, the sky starts rolling. All my seams fly open, and the moon begins its climb. The spider spins her cottony web across my mother's face. Snow enters my father's thoughts. I say it softly. Yes. I practice. Yes. And the final poem I'm going to read is also set in a museum. And I'm trying to remember, oh, here it is. This is it's about a work of art called The Throne of the Third Heaven of the Nation's Millennium General Assembly, which was made by James Hampton. The artist was James Hampton. It was found in a garage in DC, and now occupies a room in the Museum of American Art in Washington. And it was made completely of junk. Everything begged to be saved. Three-legged tables, arthritic chairs, the blind light bulbs and sprung valises longed to be lifted, transformed. With his dreaming eye, he saw them as they might become. The altar wrapped in foil, the gimpy chair reborn as throne. 6 twinned pedestals with flower faces, strumming brassy music of the unreal world. And blazoned over all, fear not. The kingdom of heaven is made of junk. Busy as a spider in the dim garage, he built it over years, fettling forth winged symmetries and curious entablatures. A makeshift architecture, tenuous as a sigh. Here, exposed to public view, it leans away, hoarding its darkness. No one has appeared to mount the throne, yet all is readiness. A velvet ribbon bars the door to the unenterable room. Thank you.
Okay, now we can all come back on the screen for our Q&A. Thank you, Joy, if you can make that happen.
Well, everyone is on the screen right now. On your view, you may not see everyone.
Hang on. Does everybody see everybody now? Is everybody there? Okay, good, good. Wow.
Your exhibits.
Jean and Linda, those were just stunning readings. Just the poems are amazing, and I can't thank you again enough for your being here. And I could listen to you for much longer than we have time for. So thank you both for those readings. They're powerful. Danny, I hope you heard the one poem that was read for you, because if I recall, you went jogging right before you joined us today, correct?
Yeah, I was just.
How did she know?
I was just thinking of that, Jean. I took a long run this morning, and somehow, I don't know if you're a runner yourself, but you inhabited the spirit of the runner, and remarkably so.
Yeah.
The line about he is thinking but not really thinking. It's
Yes.
absolutely
Yeah.
the case.
Yeah.
Really, really terrific poem.
I loved hearing that, because shortly before we came in, Danny had told me that he was going out for a run. So anyway, yeah, so we will segue now into our brief Q&A. We won't have a lot of time, but this is kind of free flowing, and you can ask each other questions. I'm going to throw out a couple of questions. What I want to say first is that for me, anyway, as a listener and as a reader of your poems, there's so many terrific things that you share as poets. I mean, your use of imagery, both of you, just that weave all the way through your poems, your killer endings that are just so powerful, the very direct, kind of quiet voices that you both employ through your poems, that your poems are, on some levels, they sound simple, but they never are simple. And that's just so hard to pull off. And I'm amazed by how you both do that. I'm wondering if both of you would mind talking a little bit about just the craft of poems, from where you first come up with an idea for a poem all the way through to your revision process. I'm thinking of, when I say when you first come up with a poem, I'm thinking of Richard Hugo's book, the Triggering Town, and where do those ideas come from for you? What sets them off? What triggers your poems? And then how do you go about crafting them into what you see as your final drafts? Could each of you talk a little bit about that? And Danny, of course, at any point when you're willing, we'd love to have you do that as well. So Jean, could you start us off?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure that there's any one thing that is the trigger. So many things can trigger. Often it's a phrase, it's often an image, a visual image, or a sort of a metaphorical image. Often it's listening to other poets and saying, oh, I remember when I was just first starting to write and going to hear Linda at the Folger Shakespeare Library and saying, oh, I can do that. And then realizing that, oh no, I can't do that. It's much harder than that. But, and then it's just a process of sitting down and sort of writing it out over and over and over until, and as I start writing new ideas, a poem can move in lots of directions. Sometimes it comes together and happens very quickly. Those are good times for, for the elfin tailor, as Kay Ryan said in a wonderful poem. And other times, it's a struggle. speaking of Richard Hugo, I'm always it's comforted by his writing in one of those essays. It's the hard ones and the ones we struggle with that make way for the easy ones. And the easy ones are a pure joy. They just happen, sort of Mozart style, you know, it just comes through you onto the page.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I was very influenced by William Stafford and his wonderful essay, Writing the Australian Crawl. When I first started writing as a very young person, I thought of poems almost as if they were essays. I would outline ideas and see, you know, what was going to come next. And then he talked about how you have to follow a poem where it wants to take you. You shouldn't take it. It has to take you. And that way you learn what you didn't know you knew. And anyone that hasn't read that essay, I'm sure you can find it online, Writing the Australian Crawl. It really changed permanently the way I wrote. Where something from, I don't like to think about too much. I'm afraid that if I think about where does this idea come from, it'll stop coming. It's the magic given. I believe that one can teach craft and make writers better in terms of craft, but if you don't have that voice and if those things don't just come to you, that can't be taught. That is the magic that, as I say, I don't like to think about too much. When I ended my last poem of the vision as the purest form of love, I would like to say to young poets, if you don't love revising, then find something else to do with your life. I must spend 10 times longer when I think a poem is finished, revising and changing. A whole poem can come quickly on the page, and then I can spend a month on just 2 words that aren't quite right. They just don't want to come. But when it is coming, and it's as if you excrete this large amount of stuff onto the page without thinking about it too much, as if you're excreting the piece of marble, and then you chip away at it. That's the revision, and you turn it into a poem.
Yeah. Well, if I may, a couple of follow-ups to that. So getting back to what you said, you want the poems to lead you where they want to go. I love that. And I totally think that that's so important. But I'm guessing then at some point along your revision process, you come to a place where you say, okay, wait, maybe I did pull this poem up a little too short. Maybe this poem did have other places to go. Can you talk a little bit about any suggestions you have for the rest of us for how to get back into a poem? Once that poem has maybe finished up a little prematurely, how do you go back in? How do you re-enter your poem and still keeping it alive? Any ideas for that?
Well, it's not a question of how do I go back into it, is how do I stop going back into it and say, okay, it's finished, because I could probably be fiddling with it forever. I think it was Auden who said, you never finish a poem, you just abandon it. And I find that even after a poem has been in a magazine, between the magazine and the book I put it in, I make changes. And I even have changes on the page of the book. I'm like Bernard in the museum. I can't stop fiddling. And when someone says, how do you know it's finished? I don't ever know it's finished, but sometimes I say, okay, that's it, that's enough.
Jean, would you like to add to that?
The trick is sort of also when to let it go, when to know you can't take it anywhere or you have to wait for it to come to itself. When I'm reading, I often change my poems a little bit in small ways. That's partly for the verbal, the difference between what's verbal and what's on the page. But I remember there was a poet here in Washington, local, named Lisa Ritchie, and she used to, she would give a reading and she would be signing books and giving them out, and she would be changing the books as she was signing them. She would, before she signed it, she would go through, she would make alterations. So
Wow.
it doesn't never end. You just have to, at some point you have to let go.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, as I'm sure you both probably know, our beloved state poet laureate, Peter Meinke, lives in St. Petersburg, and we're big fans of his. And Peter has written a textbook. He's written so many books, but one of his textbooks is The Shape of Poetry. And in that book, when he's talking about revision, Peter says that when he starts to revise, he refuses to revise for meaning, but rather he's almost always revising for music, letting the sounds kind of carry him back into the poem. And he's trusting that his imagery is doing the work of the poem for him. But I think that that's kind of interesting. But he also, as you probably know, talks a lot about form and its role in taking us as writers sometimes in unusual places, because maybe of an auditory network that's set up that, kind of sparks an idea that because of an off rhyme or a slant rhyme that takes you maybe in a direction you wouldn't have otherwise gone. And I'm wondering for both of you, I know, Linda, many of your poems, certainly not all, but many of your poems are written in shorter lines. I'm thinking maybe 4 beats or so to a line, I'm guessing, and maybe many of them get away from that. But can you talk a little bit about that? Is that, I'm guessing that that's something that just sort of creates itself as it goes along, that just feels like the natural pace for you. But would you mind talking a little bit about that, how your poems wind up on the page and how you make those decisions of your end lines?
Well, I always get angry when people talk about free verse being somewhat simpler than writing in form. I find just the opposite to be true. In free verse, you have to invent the form for each poem.
Right.
Is it better with long lines or short lines? And now with a computer, it's so much easier to experiment in terms of line length and line breaks and everything, instead of having to type it all over again and again.
Yeah.
But I find that when I've never had really terrible writer's block, but when I just can't seem to get myself to write, I'll tell myself, okay, you have to write a sonnet, you have to write a villanelle, and that will get me started. And
Really?
as I say, in some ways, the form is there for you. So you just have to fill it in. It's much easier. I actually went through a time when I couldn't stop writing sonnets. I mean, everything I wrote ended up being a sonnet, and I had to say, no, go back to creating the form on the page.
Interesting. Yeah, well, absolutely. Free verse finds its own form as it goes along. I agree completely. Jean, any thoughts on that?
Yes, just we all grew up. We're thinking about rhythm and talking about Linda's poems, but we all grew up, I believe, those of us who turn into poets, reading a lot of poetry, traditional poetry as well as modern, and we have all those old rhythms and forms in us, hiding behind the poems. They're hidden in the rhymes. They're hidden in the poems rather than explicitly on the page, but they're there.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And Danny, I know we'd welcome your input at any point, or to offer questions as well. So.
Oh, I was just, yes. As Linda particularly was speaking, I was finding myself nodding in assent about almost everything you said, Linda, particularly about revision. I too can spend 9/10 of my time happily on revision. And I say happily because the hardest part for me is simply getting the structure of the basic sense of the poem down. And the rest is playtime, which I find really enjoyable. The other thing I'll say about both Jean's and Linda's work. I enjoy the quietude of, as you said, you take on the great themes of life and death, and desire and love, but always through the lens of the particular. And I think I came to love that quietude when I was very young, 16 or 17. I discovered the Surrealists at the Louisville Free Public Library. And particularly Ponge and Michaud, but also Nicanor Parra. And their lines, I was reading in translation, so the lines were really flat and distanced in a way. And I just found that enormously appealing. And then I taught myself French and to some degree Spanish and read them. And there was a sing-songy sort of experience to their work that I was very greatly disappointed reading the original, and I'd become accustomed to the flatness of the translations. Maybe they were poor translations.
Interesting.
But I really do love both of the styles of your work. Linda, and I'll close, when you spoke of the almost elegy to Tony, and that the mind holds two thoughts at the same time when you encounter a poet or a poem that you love, particularly a series of poems. You want to read more and more of Tony's work, and yet something simultaneously, you want to close the work and write your own work. Not an imitation of his style, but just the act of writing. I find that to be utterly true. And it's occurred to me, Jean, with your work and with yours as well, Linda, that I can read poem after poem, but something in me eventually, almost unconsciously, I stop and begin writing my own work. And that's the highest compliment I think any poet can offer to another.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And also the way Tony Hoagland uses humor. It's so hard to do, and he does it so well, and to me, it never feels forced. I find it very difficult to do, but he's brilliant at that.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we probably just have time for just one other question. Well, before we do that, do you all have any questions you'd like to ask each other? Maybe not.
Ask each other questions all the time.
Okay. Well, let's actually, if you don't mind, tell any advice for young poets starting out. What would you have them read? Who are some of your favorites? You've already given advice with respect to the ways to go about to craft a poem and to love revision, and that's certainly there. But it's a tough world out there, and poetry plays a role. I have to believe that. But any thoughts that you have for young poets who may be tuning in with us this evening?
Just read.
That was exactly what.
Yes.
I mean, someone really
Like
see what they
Plume.
grasp. Right. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
And the
Well,
poets that interest you, and then look for them and read them.
Yeah. Absolutely. That is terrific advice. And I think as part of that, I would be remiss if I did not encourage all of you viewers to please pick up a copy of Plume. You can get it through several places. Amazon is one, Barnes & Noble, but also many bookstores. Tombolo.com is our hometown bookstore. And you may certainly get it there. And most importantly, please buy Linda's books and Jean's books. Alsace Valentine stands ready to order those for you through Tombolo Books. And if you will, Danny, what are the other places where you would suggest folks might be able to purchase Plume?
Oh, I think we'll put them up. You can get it through our online magazine, of course, and there's a page dedicated to that. And
Yep. You may have frozen there.
Pardon me? Yeah.
I think you froze for just a minute. Yeah. So,
Just that we sell it on the Insight as well, on the website. And so, but really, we'll put that link up and then.
sounds good.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Well, Linda and Jean and Danny, thank you also very much for being part of the Dalí Poetry Series. We really loved having you. And please know you are welcome at the museum whenever you find yourself in St. Petersburg. You have free admission. We'd love to have you. Get in touch with me and we will make that happen. And hope you'll come more than once. And Danny, of course, you're always welcome as well. And we look forward to having you back as a reader. And if we can make it happen, if we can convince you, we'll also try to put a panel together of editors who can teach us all a lot of things. So thank you all for being part of it. Thank you, viewers. God bless you, Jean. Thank you, viewers, for tuning in this evening. And know that the program will be on our Dalí YouTube channel moving forward. So all of your friends and fans can find you there in the future. So thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.